So, one thing I wanted to talk about is, I get a lot of ridiculous responses. I get a lot of great responses to my content. But I also get some people who say ridiculous things like if you okay, one of the things I can't stand is when people are like, if you don't like it, why don't you just stop watching it? Well, for one thing, I'm a TV critic, so that's part of the answer. But even if I wasn't a TV critic, maybe I'm watching because I hope it gets good. Maybe I'm watching because I want to see it through. Maybe it sucks that it sucks because I was looking forward to it. And like something like The Rings of Power is I'd love to have a big budget Tolkien show that really was really entertaining and that I loved. And it sucks when we don't get that. But just telling people not to watch it is like just dismissing them. Like, oh, you don't like the food? Well, then go hungry. Okay, well, no, maybe I actually would like to have better food. Maybe complaining about things actually sometimes means we get better things. Not always, but it can't hurt. But what I wanted to talk about today was this response that I get from a lot of people when I post criticism of the Rings of Power, that it's just fantasy. It's just fantasy. It's just fantasy. Oh, that volcano didn't kill everybody. Oh, it's just fantasy. Oh, you're so worried about the fast travel. It's just fantasy. Um, you know, Honestly, I think this would be something that would annoy Tolkien himself because just fantasy is just an absurd like hand waving of any legitimate criticism of a show like The Rings of Power. Like, just because something is fantasy doesn't mean that the internal logic of the show or the book or whatever it is doesn't matter. You know, sure, okay, it's just fantasy. Well, if that is your answer to any criticism, then why aren't spaceships and dinosaurs and like time travel machines and all this other stuff showing up in the Rings of Power? Why do we have to worry about the laws of gravity? Why can't everyone just fly and breathe fire out of their mouths? Like, if there's no rules because it's just fantasy, then there's no rules. People can do whatever they want. If that's not the case, and that seems fairly radical when you think about it, if that's not the case, if you can't just suddenly have pink elephants in camouflage khakis and like rolling around with machine guns show up to fight the orcs, then you have to accept that. Then you have to accept that there are some rules within the fiction, right? And that not everything is going to be can be hand waved away by it's just fantasy. So when a volcano goes off and blasts through this town, the one town that exists in the Southlands, Mordor, sorry, and pretty much nobody except for a very small bit part character and a bunch of extras dies, and like people are totally unscathed, basically no burns or cuts or anything. That defies the internal logic of the show, which is that this was a powerful volcano blast. It was a big deal. It decimated this whole countryside and created the realm of evil and shadow. But nobody got a scratch, you know. Or when Halbrand is wounded, and just at a glance, Galadriel can tell he needs elvish healing. Elvish healing. And he can, he's so wounded that he needs this extra care. Well, earlier, Arendir said that there is no elvish healer. There's no elvish healers. And then moments later, Halbrand just stands up, walks out, and gets on a horse. Apparently, they're going to ride to a Region or Linden or something, which is, a massive journey for someone who is so wounded that just, regular old human healing won't do the trick. These are things that defy internal logic within the show. Galadriel presents a problem. His wound is so bad that he needs special elvish healing. Oh yeah, elvish healing, baby. And then, moments later, he's getting up on a horse and riding off. These things matter because to create a fantasy world that you can become immersed in, you need to have plausibility. You can't just create a fantasy world where everything just happens willy-nilly. The story still needs to make sense. You still have to have a coherent plot. There's a reason that Tolkien said he was meticulous about distances and maps. Because so much of his story is about the journey. So much of The Lord of the Rings is about that travel from the Shire to Mount Doom and everywhere in between. And the struggles of crossing mountains that are overrun by magical snowstorms, and the conflicts that arise. Same with the Hobbit, there and back again, right? There's the trolls. There's all these things that happen because it's a journey. Because people don't just fast travel places, and because stories rely on a sense of time and place, of distance, of time passing, and people come back with this idea that it's just fantasy, as though that explains why all these things aren't there. Well, guess what? Lord of the Rings is just fantasy. But it is meticulously crafted fantasy. Same with George R. R. Martin's stuff, right? If you read the Game of Thrones books, or Fire and Blood, what's the basis of House of the Dragon, like these, there's meticulous attention to detail, including how much time passes, including these elaborate family trees, and the geography matters. All these things really do matter. And it's funny because for years I've been seeing this sort of critique of criticism, right? Or of fiction. I remember years and years ago when the last Song of Ice and Fire book came out. It was just Dance of Dragons. Yeah. A feminist critic of that, who I had a little bit of a scuffle with at the time, and this is over a decade ago, said that George R. R. Martin portrayed women as, portrayed all this sexual violence on all these bad things happening to women. And why did he have to do that? It's just a fantasy. There's dragons and stuff. So why can't he portray a fantasy world where, this stuff doesn't happen? And it's like, well, it's just a fantasy doesn't mean that the story shouldn't have any aspects of realism to it, right? In George R. R. Martin's world, it's a dark world for everybody. But, a lot of women in his stories die in childbirth, because that was actually a pretty common way to die as a woman before modern medicine came around. And his stories are grim and harsh and brutal because they show a version of our world. And a fantasy version, sure. I mean, there are women who ride around on dragons. That doesn't happen in our world. That's the fantasy component. The realism that helps make these stories feel more believable and plausible comes with stuff like, the dangers of childbirth in an era where modern medicine didn't exist, or the succession in like House of the Dragon, where it's very, very controversial to have a woman heir to the throne, just like it was in medieval times in our own world. And the problem with this idea that it's just fantasy is that you're wiping away every possible critique of storytelling, of world building, of pacing, of filmmaking, all of these things. And in doing so, you're saying that because it's fantasy, those things don't need to apply. Because it's fantasy, it can just be shit. See, the critic is asking for things to be better. The critic says, I have watched this show or read this book or played this game, and here's what I found that I liked, and here's what I found that I didn't like, and if you do this, it can be better, right? If you write all 3 Star Wars sequel movies at the same time and have a coherent story from beginning to end, you will have a better trilogy. Oh, but it's just fantasy. It's just fantasy. It's just Star Wars. Well, yeah, but we can have better. We don't have to settle. I've seen people say, well, I can't believe all these haters are just complaining. I mean, you get more Lord of the Rings. You get more Lord of the Rings. Why are you complaining about that? Well, because it doesn't feel like Lord of the Rings, does it? It feels like a cheap imitation. And I would have loved to have a cool, badass Second Age Lord of the Rings show, The Fall of Numenor or something. That would be dope. But instead we got this. And this isn't good. And you cannot just say, well, it's just fantasy. Because that doesn't cut it. That is not an actual response to criticism. I mean, you could... Anyways, okay, I've said enough. I'll stop now. Thank you for watching. Peace.